Well, welcome everybody. When I was in Tamworth in May, I had a participant at my workshop who was a mum who had been to my workshop 15 years ago, and it was funny. I recognised her face, and she came up to me at the end and she was like, Sue, look, I came along today to tell you, I just want to tell you about my son and how well he's doing. I'm like, oh, I love hearing these things. And she said how, like, years ago at my workshops, I talked about the importance of children having chores and volunteering to work towards a job. And it's so true. And I learned a lot of this from my guest, Yenn, who is on the podcast today. Yenn wrote a wonderful book called The Wonderful World of Work, and we've got the tips available for you today. But what I realised is I haven't talked about work for ages, and I thought I really wanted to talk to you about that because this mum inspired me to remember that it's so important that we start young. Like in the classroom, giving a child a chore or a job, these are all future work skills. Looking at, like, begin with the end in mind, giving children jobs at home. These are chores, as one of my friends used to say, it's called work, not play. Children need to learn to work. It can be boring. We all have to do boring things. We all have to do chores we don't necessarily enjoy or work. So preparing our children with those things is so important. But just made me teary when the mum was sharing with me in Tamworth, not only did her son go on to volunteer in lots of organisations, he ended up meeting his future partner through volunteering. By the sounds of things, what she said, and I was trying to remember her name to get her to come on and share, but I couldn't remember, which is so bad. So I apologise if you're listening. Please email me. What she shared was not only has he got a job working in a mine now, he loves money. And I think this is a thing that if you're doing chores at home and a child's getting paid, they start to realise the power of money. And it's important we teach children financial literacy. I think it's such an important skill for all our children to learn financial literacy. So what we used to have is their set jobs that they had to do and then jobs they could earn money. This is at our house. So they were jobs, they were replacing something Andrew and I would do. So adult responsibility jobs. So that might be washing the car. There were, walking the dog, that's a family job. But there were other jobs they could do to earn money, including all three of my children have packed orders for you. They have made tokens up for the token sheets. I mean, a lot of the things on my website, my kids do a lot of the visuals because they want to earn extra money. My daughter Eliza is living in London and London's expensive. So she regularly goes, can I make up some visuals for you, Mum, to go to earn some extra money? So I think it's really important that we teach children that they can do jobs to earn money. But what this helped this young boy and now man was to learn the power of money. And very excitingly, especially in Australia at the moment, he's now, bought a house because he's learned about money. So I would love parents to think about what chores children can do that are just regular chores they have to do every week, and then start to teach them the importance of money. What one of my mums did years ago, her son always wanted like Lego at Star Wars. It was like $100 at Target or Kmart or whatever. And she would actually, because often by the time he earned the money, they couldn't find it. But what she would do, she'd lay by it, because then he'd go in every week and pay a little bit more off. And the staff at the lay-by were lovely. They would bring it out, remind him take it out of the plastic, show him what he was earning towards. And then every week he would earn that money. I remember in year 6 at school, I had a fabulous teacher and we all had shops and we had like pretend money, like Monopoly. And we learned about money through those shops. Now, me being me, I worked out if I cooked real baked goods, more people would come to my shop. And I would sell cakes to my friends and everyone at school because they were just giving me paper money. So I laugh. That was probably my first business back then. So anyway, that's just an aside. But I want you to think, what could your kids be doing? I know our kids in our street every year would do a stall to raise money on Australia Day. Every year they would raise money, whether, fires or their dog shelter, doing those things. Think of the skills you learn. I want you to today just reflect. What was your first job? Was it babysitting? Was it collecting the mail for a neighbour? Was it, did you ever have a lemonade stall? Did you ever have something at school where you had that money, like Mrs. Larky Bucks, I've had that where we've set up shops in the classroom. I mean, in this day and age, of course, everything's cashless, but children still need to learn the power of money. And I think what the mum told me was so important, that it's not just about doing the chores and doing the volunteer work. It's also about helping him understand how money works. So I love that. Now, the reason that Yenn recommends volunteering as a first job is volunteering people are more forgiving, I think is the way Yenn would put it, that when you go and volunteer, you can just volunteer for 3 hours. And that might be the capacity for some of our children. So actually going and doing volunteering is a great way. Any of you who have local footy clubs, I'm a big fan of getting kids down working on the barbecue because, again, they get to learn money, they get to learn some cooking skills, they get to learn social skills. And I can assure you every sporting club would love somebody to come and help out on the barbecue. They are always looking for volunteers. And you might just do a 1 hour shift, but what a great way to connect with your community and learn a whole lot of skills through that 1 hour. So begin with the end in mind. What are some things you could do to help your children with chores, jobs, and volunteering? What are some things you could do to help them understand money and financial literacy? And maybe if it's school holidays when you're listening to this, how about you get out Monopoly at home and have a go of that? That's a great way for kids to learn a little bit of money skills. And winning and losing, the social skills there. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. Yenn's books are on my website. They also have some amazing books on mental health. I think Yenn's written at least 10 books now, and I love Yenn's blog as well. So I highly recommend that you really think after this podcast, what can you do to develop work and financial skills? Today, I'll be interviewing Yenn Purkis. Yenn is an autistic author, speaker, and advocate. Yenn is an avid writer, not only writing fabulous books, but also has a wonderful blog. I highly recommend you sign up to their blog and follow them on Facebook, which I'll link to in the podcast notes. I find Yenn's writing and weekly quotes a source of insight, understanding, and inspiration. Yenn has a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome and atypical schizophrenia. For me, Yenn sharing their mental health challenges has helped me support the students I know and their families. 2 years ago, Yenn affirmed they are non-binary gender and changed their name from Jeanette to Yenn. Congratulations on that name change, by the way.
Thank you.
I know it was a wonderful moment, and I'd encourage readers to read your blog about that, because I think you sharing that journey was just so gorgeous, and I felt a real celebration for you in that journey. So well done. But I just want to let you know about the name change, because unfortunately the books are still under Jeanette Purkis, and I would hate people to, after this, be all excited and go looking for books they can't find. Of course, all the books are on my website, but for people overseas, you'll need to look under Jeanette Purkis in Amazon and so forth. Yenn has authored numerous books covering everything from women with AS, mental health, education. They're all on my website, or you'll find them on other websites around the world. But today, I want to focus on the book I use all the time and highly recommend, called The Wonderful World of Work. So welcome, Yenn. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be on the show.
Can you share with us why you wrote The Wonderful World of Work?
There's most of my books, I can't remember why I wrote them, but this one I really can. So I was in the psych ward, as I sometimes am, with my mental illness, and I met a young man who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And when I told this young man that I was a public servant and had written at that point one book, he said, "You're lying. That's not possible." And for this young man, it wasn't possible. Those things weren't possible because all he'd been given was deficits thinking. Everything he knew about autism was negative, and everything was about what he couldn't do. He dropped out of school in year 9 and had never re-engaged with any kind of educational training at all. And so I looked at this young man and I thought, I bet there's more than one of you. And the other thing I thought was, an early diagnosis isn't necessarily a good thing. So we actually need to scaffold people's self-knowledge and empowerment and sense of who they are in order to get good outcomes. It's not just a matter of having the diagnosis. So I didn't get my diagnosis until I was an adult, and I always thought that was what had held me back. And I thought if I'd been diagnosed as a child, my life would have been totally different. Probably would have been, but it wouldn't necessarily have been good. And up until that point, I thought an early diagnosis always is a good thing. But an early diagnosis with nothing but deficits thinking is not a good thing. So I wondered what I could do in order to actually support young people in their journey. And I thought employment, for me, having a full-time professional job has been life-changing and has been a real positive. And I thought, well, maybe I can start there, and maybe I can look at employment as a means of empowerment for young people on the spectrum. So if they can get a job and it's a positive experience and it's a good job and, you know, it's the team are respectful, managers are respectful, all of that, if I can get kids into that position, that's got to be a good thing. And so that was what I did. And with the book, it was all about getting a job, but not just getting a job, but thriving at work and knowing some strategies based in my experience, because at that point I'd been a public servant for 5 years, and now I've been a public servant for 13 years, and I still talk about employment. There's some other people talking about employment who are great as well. Barb Cook, I would look up as well. She's fantastic. But yeah, that was what really drove that book.
I love that. You've made me all tingly, because for me, this is what I know for many of my teens when they're actually disengaged in school, getting them to think about work beyond school and even getting a part-time job, or some of the things you recommend in the book about volunteering or going to work with, mentors and connecting and letting them know, because school can be the most complex and horrible time for many of my kids, but letting them know there is something beyond the school and giving them something to look forward to in a positive, affirming way. And I think too, so many of my kids unfortunately become quite traumatized in secondary, as you say, because of their negativeness about their diagnosis. So I know it's a little bit off topic, but I was really interested when you talked about that thinking an earlier diagnosis was better, was harder. It's how we package it. I think I can't leave that on the table without just asking, what are some ways that we can ensure that autism pride and that positivity around identity on the spectrum?
I think reading and looking at things by actually autistic people is key. When I have parents say to me, I want to know about, pride and all of that, I say, well, go read some blogs by autistic bloggers, go look at sites like Reframing Autism or the ICANN network and positive autistic-led things which are going to be really showing up that positivity and all of those good things that autistic people can do. And just as soon as you start, check your negativity. Like as soon as you start being negative, try and check that and say, okay, how can I reframe that in a positive way? Because, the messages you give to kids are huge. They make such a difference, those messages, and sometimes it can be very subtle, but it's really important to keep an eye out and check yourself with those things.
Absolutely. And for me, I say to parents, there are so many mentors out there now. The child doesn't or student doesn't have to meet that person. They can find some Facebook pages or positive groups. And I'm all about reading personal accounts. I don't really like novels that have people with ASD in them because I never find they're like the people I know, you know, and finding those positive mentors who, like you, and that's why I read your blog and stuff every week, because for me, you're my mentor. You're giving me the insights of understanding and those little words of inspiration, but also making me reflect on the kids I might have worked with that week or met that week or the families. And I think for the kids, knowing there are other people out there who might have had the same challenges, but how they've turned them around and made them positive.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to work. So what tips can you share with us how you've seen the book used, or what tips can you share with listeners that can make a difference?
I've had a few parents come up to me and say, my child got a job after reading this book. I've had a lot of parents say, my child found this book, wasn't particularly interested, but then 3 months later I found it in their room and it was covered in notes. And it's got areas where you can write, where the kids can write notes about their experience and thinking and all of that. It's a really hands-on, practical thing. I use some of the strategies in it myself. One of them would be talking to other people who are experienced in whatever area I'm interested in. I think that's always a good idea, to talk to people with experience. Practicing interview technique, that's really important. Now, I'm not a big job interview fan. I don't think many people are. So if I have to have one, I'll imagine what questions they ask me and I'll respond, and I'll do it like in front of the mirror. And I find that really helps because I do get quite anxious about job interviews. And I usually do quite well. I usually get offered the position. So that's pretty nice.
Yeah, just on the job interview, this is where sometimes I have to say to my kids, like when I'm saying to them about going for a job, is, you know, you're going to have people looking at you, you know, 3 people often on a panel looking at you. And I think that's the daunting part, that they might be used to one-on-one, but that 3 people. And of course, most of the kids I work with pick up on those emotions and don't always know what that feeling is in the room. And so nearly practicing that, and I know I've done that before where we've done little mock interviews, but saying to the people listening, look, you're probably not going to be smiling back. You're not going to be giving many clues or encouragement, because I think for many of my kids, they're amazing at picking up on that more than people realise. And giving them those skills about how daunting. But I'm really hoping, and I just hope with the whole world changing, that people will do more Zoom. Why can't we do a Zoom interview?
Yeah. I was involved in some interviewing when I worked in HR in a government department, and we did the ones interstate, we did remotely via, well, it would have been by Skype, and it was much better. The other thing is I've been involved in my paid job in doing work trials. So we've been running an autism and employment program, and I devised this. So instead of doing interviews for the applicants, all of whom are autistic, we set them a task or tasks and get them to do that. And the manager who will be managing them is in the room and I'm in the room. And instead of having to have questions fired at them, they just have to prove their ability to do part of the job, which actually benefits the employer. That actually benefits
inspiring. This is why I love your stuff, because I hear that and I go, that is so logical. Why do we even bother with an interview? We should be doing hands-on. And that's what Temple Grandin talks about. She had to sell her folders and portfolios, not herself. Yeah. So important. So when you're saying you've heard parents tell you, most of my secondary schools would have your book, because I really encourage a lot of my schools, because a lot of schools have a school, someone who helps them with the post jobs, where the different schools have different job titles. But I say to them exactly what you're saying, because your workbook's actually something I can take home and write in and think about it. The careers counsellor at the school or advisor can actually have that as a brilliant resource. And I find, any of my neurodiverse kids, because they don't know what questions to ask, they don't know where to start. And your book gives them the scaffolding of what to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that it's meant to be practical. All of my books, except my autobiography, have the word practical or guide somewhere in the title or subtitle.
Which is what people need, yeah. And that's, I guess, why I love it, because I call myself a pracademic, which is a practical academic. I'm all about what are the practical skills, and why, I guess, when I first picked up your book, there was nothing around. There was absolutely nothing for my students, and I'd been looking and tried to write stuff myself, but I didn't have the ASD perspective, and that's what shines through in your books. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And is there any other tips or strategies you would recommend for families and schools?
I have a strategy around disclosure. You don't have to follow it, but just think about disclosure before you have to make a decision about disclosure, because you don't want to be, that's a big decision, and you don't want to be making it on the fly. You want to make sure you've given it some consideration. I generally advise people that disclosing is a positive. However, some workplaces it clearly isn't. And also, I mean, when I joined the public service, which was, a real job, not that other jobs aren't real, but it was a significant full-time officey thing, I disclosed because I knew I'd be in that workplace, or I thought I'd be in that workplace for a long time. Whereas the job I had before I joined the public service was a student job, and I was collecting money for charity. And I didn't disclose then, because what would the point be? I had nothing invested in this job. It was just something I did to make a living. So I didn't really need to disclose in my mind, so I didn't. So it does depend on the circumstances. And I would say that people should have a think about whether they're going to disclose, when they're going to disclose, who they're going to tell, how much they're going to tell, all of those things, and just sit down and have a think about that, and that can inform your decision around disclosure, because it is a big one. That's really, anyone with an invisible disability, that's a big deal.
I couldn't agree more. And for many of my parents, it's a big worry too. Like, I've had parents whose son got a job at the local Subway as that first step, and he was super excited, but she could see the challenges that were going to come up. One of the challenges was the owner would just let him know an hour before a shift. And of course, his anxiety would just be out of control all day, wondering if he was going to get told about the shift, and needing that pre-warning. And where his mum was she of course wanted to go down there and say to the manager, you can't just tell my son an hour before his shift. He's all day anxious, checking his phone, worried, And so what she got him to do is not say about his AS, which he wasn't comfortable with, but just to go down and say, unfortunately, I need more warning because I have other things in my life, sort of to package the challenge in a way to say to the boss, if you need me to work, I need 24 hours notice. And I mean, I think that's a fair call, but for him, that was really hard to do. But was very important, because it was going to impact on him keeping the job. And then not, because what would happen, he would get so anxious when he turned up, he didn't perform very well.
Yeah.
And I think those are the things. And I think, as you say, with invisible disabilities, this is the challenge I have in schools too, with teenagers who often don't want their teachers to know, or don't want people at school to know, which totally makes sense. And what I think the tips you're giving there, how you're going to disclose, how much, I think this is relevant in not just the workplace, but in school settings too.
Definitely, especially with older kids.
Yeah, but I always say, I always think autism spectrum is a diffability, not a disability, a different way of thinking. And I really do. If you understand that different way of thinking, then it's not a disability, but I do believe the disability is the invisibleness that so often people don't, especially teachers, don't realise the accommodations the child needs until they see the behaviour. And that's then often is hard to reframe, because the teacher's thinking about the behaviour. So that's for me where I think teachers knowing up front is really important, because of that invisibility of the disability. Yeah.
I think knowledge is power with this stuff. Absolutely. The other thing is, it's really interesting, because as an autistic advocate, I'm very much focused on strengths and positives and empowerment and pride and all of those things. And so when someone goes and gets a diagnosis, it's a medical diagnosis and it's based on deficits. Now, in order to access the supports that people need, they need that medical model. But in order to be proud and have positive self-knowledge, they don't. And I don't know what the reconciliation of those things is. But it's a problem I come up against a lot, that in order to access support, you need the medical label. But actually, in order to be proud of yourself and value who you are and, you know, follow neurodiversity and different, not less, and all of that, that medical diagnosis is actually counterproductive. So it's something I'd love to recommend. But it's really tricky.
Well, you and me both. And it's really interesting, as you're saying that, there's two things that come to mind. When I worked with Indigenous communities, they don't like labelling for that reason. So a lot of Indigenous communities are like, well, this is a child in our community. We look after them no matter who they are, and we don't need a label or a negative model. But, of course, the funding is all based on that. So then they're in this dilemma. But the other one is IEP meetings. I've reframed how I do creating supports for students. And I always start, what are 3 positives? Because I feel like we go really negative really fast in those meetings. And when I'm doing individual plans, I really like to start with, hey, what's working? What are the wins here? And then what are the things we need to address? Because so often everyone's just sitting around talking. I wouldn't want people sitting around talking about me in a negative way. There's so many things I can improve in my own life. I don't know. I wish you and I could solve that one. I really would love to change that deficit model. I can't stand it. So, and I think the other thing with that is, for me, and I don't know how this comes across to you as a person with a lived experience, but I absolutely love kids with neurodiversity in my classroom. So I think they make my classroom a better classroom. So I don't want to think of them in a negative way. Does that, so how do we reframe that? But hopefully, the ICANN network and people like that, enough of us change the thinking. Hopefully we can move that model. Like, I like the fact we've moved from autism awareness to autism acceptance.
Yeah, definitely. I have a number of memes about autism acceptance that every April I turn up with a few of them.
And I love your memes, and I do print them out and put them on my own fridge at home for my teenagers who need to be reminded. And you've got to keep that messaging, even though my children are so-called neurotypical, they're diverse neurotypical kids, and they need to, the more I can make them really just what I like about your memes, they make you question and reflect, and I think that's so powerful.
It's funny being me, because I look at my work and I think, gee, who's interested in this? I'm just stating the obvious. But then, of course, I am stating the obvious because I'm me and it's obvious to me. But I really find that quite amusing. Because, I love your thing. I'm like, really? Stating the obvious.
Yeah, I know. But what I like, you write it in such a succinct way and an honest way. And half the time you're just agreeing with it, but you've never thought it. Does that, you're bringing my subconscious to my conscious. And
I think people benefit from having reassurance of stuff they already know as well.
So true.
So I find a lot of the memes are probably like that. People already have heard the idea, but they haven't sort of sat and thought about it. So
absolutely.
Every weekend I sit there and have a meme session. I've been reusing old ones lately, but yes.
Because I'm amazed how many you can produce. I mean, your writing is amazing. Do you find it relaxing to write the memes?
Yeah, I get in a creative space. So it's the same when I'm painting as well. I just get really intensely focused. And it doesn't take long. It takes a few minutes to do each one of them. And most of that is just putting the background in or any images and stuff like that. The actual words come to me like that, just instantly.
Wow.
I'm really lucky. I have a prodigious skill at writing. I used to write poetry, like good poetry, when I was 7. So, and I have a niece who's exactly the same. How cool is that?
That is so cool. See, for me, I would probably spend an hour trying to write one meme and then talk myself out of it being a good idea. So not only are you able to produce it, but you're able to share it And I think that's really amazing.
There's quite a few that have not made it to social media land, because I thought, I don't know that I can say that. Not many, but there's certainly a number of them. I think one of them was bullying is always the fault of the bully, which is true. But then I got paranoid that someone might disagree and say that, and it would just get really unpleasant. So I didn't post that.
Well, that's another big challenge I have in schools with bullying and telling my kids to ignore and walk away, or it's not, I just get so upset because it's horrible and it's traumatic, and you can't. I'd like you to publish that one, please. I back that one, the bullying one. Sounds good. Well, I like to keep my podcast short, sharp and terrific. Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we've missed about work, or any things that thoughts you'd had about this area?
Oh, look, I guess the thing about work is just to focus on your strengths and focus on what you can do, and, your abilities, such as they are, enable flexibility with employers. That's what employers need across the board, is flexibility and seeing the positives of autistic staff members. And we've got all these wonderful programs going at the moment, the Dandelion program and Specialist Earner, and all sorts of really good things happening that can support autistic job seekers in order to get a job. And you don't need to use one of those. I didn't use one of those programs. They didn't exist when I got my job. But, take what support you can and focus on what you can do and focus on your strengths. And, enjoy
Absolutely.
your job.
No, absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Yenn. I really appreciate your time joining me on the podcast and sharing some wonderful tips and insights on not just work, but a whole lot of other fabulous things.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, what amazing insights and understanding that Yenn has given us, and I hope inspired you to think about work for many of your young people. I hope you've got some great tips and strategies to make a difference. Remember, strategies wear out, and not every strategy works for everybody. If you're ready to dive in deeper to more strategies and ideas to make a difference, I'd highly recommend you consider Dr. Tony Attwood or my online courses. For more information, visit my website www.sulaki.com.au.